Oh, I'm sorry I'm late. There was just so much traffic.
I can tell. I've been here for an hour now. Yeah.
So, what are we doing?
The econ project?
Oh, yeah. Isn't that due tomorrow?
Well, I've been researching.
Well, what kind of games do you like to play?
I like to play, like, more shoot-'em-up type games, like different Call of Duty games, and Destiny, and Halo, those kind of games.
Really? Well, I kind of like to play indie games, you know, like Enter the Gungeon, Stardew Valley, Undertale, those types of things.
Oh. Those are some pretty different games, actually.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how different the genres are.
Yeah, I'm sure most people don't actually know, like, the big differences.
Well, maybe we should explain.
We can do our project on that!
We can do our project on video games! What about those games makes you like them so much?
Well, my types of games are made by big companies, big producers, which usually produce frequent games that have really high budgets and lots of time and energy put into them. They'll have big teams with lots of people, usually working on one big project or multiple different projects. So they can get a lot done, like every year, produce new games. It's kind of cool, because then you always know that there will be a constant degree of quality, and you'll know what you'll be getting in each different
Right,
game.
so you have that kind of security in your purchase when you get those kinds of games.
What they call AAA games are video games with the highest development budgets and levels of promotion. Action genre games, like first-person shooters, sports games, and third-person open-world games are very popular amongst AAA games. Examples would be Destiny, Call of Duty, Battlefield, Halo, FIFA, Madden, and GTA.
Well, with indie games, it's kind of a risk. So indie games are usually single-party producers or just a couple people working on a team and trying to like make it big into the gaming community. So a lot of the times they have a lot of smaller budgets compared to AAA titles, and a lot of them scope different genres. A lot of AAA games are usually like first-person shooters, like you said, shoot-'em-up games, but indie games often approach RPG elements, role-playing games, and different aspects like that, puzzle games. The game Undertale really took a risk with storytelling. There's not a lot of combat involved, it's really just a game where you explore a world and you listen to the stories of different characters. So it's very different from how games like Halo and Call of Duty present themselves.
Undertale was Toby Fox's first game and was a great success, selling over 500,000 copies at launch. Stardew Valley was released in 2016 by its single developer Eric Barone. He was not able to find any programming work upon leaving college, so he took a risk and decided to make something of his own. Each copy of Stardew Valley sold for $15. The responses to this relaxing, old-school-looking farming game were extremely positive. Available on PC, Xbox One, and PS4, Barone's profits are estimated to be around $35 million. It is a rare occurrence for indie games to be so popular. Part of Stardew Valley's success can be attributed to the game's nostalgic look that reminds players of an earlier AAA franchise, Harvest Moon, which hasn't put out a new game in a long time. In this sense, it's hard to profit off of an original idea since Stardew Valley was made to honor Harvest Moon. Siege Sloth is an indie game studio and it's working on releasing its first title, called Evergreen. Evergreen is described as a Zen single-player game where growing a magical tree gives the player insight into the history of the planet. This single-party developer has provided a unique experience for fans because it keeps an updated development blog detailing all the work and costs that go into creating a game like Evergreen. Their total costs came out at around $36,000, which is a lot for a studio comprised of only a few people. Most of their money went into marketing, coming out to around $25,000, while the rest went into software and office space. However, after hiring a whole team, putting 2 years of work into their game, Evergreen was recently postponed, despite positive player feedback. Because of issues with moving the game from computers to mobile devices, this just highlights one of the many difficulties that goes into making an indie game.
So a huge part of what makes indie games is they're small teams or even single person teams. So how do your games have so many people working on them?
There are a set number of developers that make up this oligopoly, which is where specific companies, only a few specific companies, actually take up most of the power in the video game industry. So with only so many companies, all the power gets siphoned into only a few. So they get the most resources, the most time, and since they're only working on certain projects and not small, various different projects, they have all the time to just work on the next Call of Duty game, the next Halo game. And they already know what their viewers want, they already know what people are expecting, so they can put all their time and effort into their big teams on their specific projects. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 cost $50 million in development costs. Grand Theft Auto 5 cost $137 million in development. So how is it that indie people can make pretty good games with only a couple people?
Yeah, it's really interesting because there's such a huge competition with the AAA titles. So you really have to sell your game and make sure that you have like a near perfect advertising campaign. Your budget is basically flawless. And a lot of indie games do that, but they just don't get the success that they want because these barriers to entry, like there's just already so many quality games out there that you really have to convince buyers that this indie game is right for you. In a sense, it's really about luck.
When it comes to bigger games, usually they get a lot of money because people bought their previous game. They're getting another one. They might as well ride the bandwagon and just get the next, Just Cause game,
Like Destiny 1 and Destiny 2.
Like Destiny 1 and Destiny 2. Even a lot of people who didn't get the first Destiny, which was made by Bungie, which was a really big game when it first came out. Even if you didn't get the first one, now that the first one was so popular and they made a second one, a lot of people are just buying the second one because might as well. A lot of people got it. So they're getting a lot of money off just the fact that their name is so popular because they make so many big high quality games already.
So it's because of those resources that major game developers have that make a lot of indie game developers feel discouraged from producing their games because they know that there's already a huge fan base out there for AAA titles, and it's really hard to try to siphon away that player base to a new player base created for a brand new game that has no previous title or previous installment that guarantees people the quality.
Indie games often run into a lot of trouble because they can't guarantee quality like major developers can, because usually they've never put out a game before and don't have a big fan following. Take Hiveswap, for example, a role-playing game based on a popular online comic. In 2012, it gathered $2 million through crowdfunding because fans of the comic were excited to see the story develop in a video game format. However, almost 5 years went by with no news of Hiveswap. This led a lot of people to feel cheated out of their money and redact their support. Thankfully, this year, Hiveswap was successfully released and many people said it was worth the wait. Had their marketing campaign been consistent and reliable, though, they would have kept a lot more fans. Crowdfunding using websites like Kickstarter is pivotal to indie games, pitching an idea and drawing support from random gamers on the internet. However, not all crowdfunding is successful, and many indie game creators have to pay out of pocket. This is evident with the newly released game called Cuphead. Its two creators were passionate about their project but had little access to all the resources they would need to make it. They ended up having to take the biggest risk of their careers and quit their jobs using their own money in addition to what they could scrounge up from hopeful fans. Thankfully, though, the game was a huge hit, praised for its animation style that resembled that of the 1930s and challenging gameplay, selling over 1 million copies on the first week of its release.
I bet indie games don't even really have any stock, do they?
I guess not.
Because big companies would have lots of advertising and all different kinds of materials and merchandising from their games that they could just put out stock and people would buy it and make money off of it. But indie games, if they're so small, probably don't even have
Yeah,
anything.
so for a lot of indie games, or I would like to say the majority of indie games, don't offer stock.
A unique case is Minecraft. Minecraft started out indie, made by a single person known to the internet as Notch, who then simply called it Cave Game. It's a game where you're a dude made of cubes and you punch other stuff made of cubes. In 2009, the game, now called Minecraft, in its incomplete state, was made available to players. The gameplay was simple and accessible and picked up popularity among all age groups. I would still consider it an indie game. Notch was still running the show and putting out consistent updates upon receiving fan feedback. In 2014, though, Microsoft noticed Minecraft's potential and bought Notch's company for $2.5 billion. Now, it can easily be considered a AAA game because of the resources Microsoft can afford to put into it. It was ported to Xbox and PlayStation platforms and continues to be extremely successful.
Once Minecraft was purchased by Microsoft, it had a place in Microsoft's stock. Minecraft stock is now worth $83.81. Electronic Arts, or EA, stock is currently worth $116.89. A share of Nintendo's stock is currently worth, on average, $378.11. EA bought the studios BioWare and Pandemic Studios for $775 million in 2007. BioWare was a role-play developer in Canada who started games like Star Wars: The Old Republic. Pandemic Studios helped with Star Wars Battlefront. Both of these companies later closed due to EA's purchasing of it. EA bought Westwood Studios Inc., an indie company based in Nevada, in 2003, forcing the company to close with all of its workers gone.
So we talk about these game developers having such a huge audience. What is that audience?
Well, I know at least for my games, the big name games, usually it's, younger men that's typically oriented towards, especially with first-person shooter and war-type games, especially Call of Duty and Battlefield. Definitely geared towards more of a male audience. They're trying to get more females now, including more female protagonists, like the female protagonist in Tomb Raider.
Alright. And yeah, I feel like I would say that it's very similar for indie games, but since there's a lot of different genres, it doesn't necessarily target just a male audience. But I do think that it would still target the same age range, like the 14 to 20
Yeah, so they
people.
kind of have like the same people, so they're probably competing for similar people.
Similar people.
Yeah.
So what about budgets?
Yeah, because big name developers seem to have a lot more money than indie developers do, especially when it comes to advertisement. Because like we said earlier, advertising is a really big part of what makes the game popular. Like you said with indie developers, if they want people to play their game, they need to advertise it. So if no one knows it's there, they're not going to know it even exists. At least with bigger names like Assassin's Creed, they know the name. Yeah. They can look it up and see if there's a new one. But indie games, no. Which is kind of awkward because usually big name AAA games have a lot of money put into their advertisement. Since AAA game developers have budgets in the hundreds of millions, they spend most of their initial costs on advertising, usually more than spent on development. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 spent $200 million in marketing. Grand Theft Auto 5 spent $128 million in marketing costs. You see the new Call of Duty World War II ad?
No, I haven't.
It's had a lot of money put into that animation.
Really?
It looks cool, but that's the point. Insert clip.
Hey, stop! He's not worth it. Daniels.
Gentlemen, we're on the verge of the biggest operation of the entire war.
All right, fellas. This is our chance to break out of Normandy.
Wow, that was really cool. But you know what you should check out? The trailer for Undertale, one of the most popular indie games of
Undertale
last
had
year.
a trailer?
Yeah, it did
I
have a
actually
trailer.
didn't know it had a trailer.
Well, I'm about to show it to you.
Okay.
Oh, hey, how are you? Yeah, I'm just doing this econ project, whatever, on like video games, and it's so boring. What are you up to? Did he really? No, there's no way. You sure?
Well, she's gone. I guess I could talk about the different consumer expectations of big name games, because there are a lot more than indie games. Consumers will expect state-of-the-art visuals from AAA games. This is troublesome because graphics and game engines are constantly evolving. Big name companies often have a lot more funds to be able to max out their graphics compared to indie games. Players prefer at least decent voice acting and a good soundtrack, and similarities to past entries into that specific game franchise. Games with a multiplayer option are usually more popular. Games like Call of Duty and Halo have kept gameplay relatively similar across each of their games, despite making new games very frequently. Hey, I finished my part of the econ project. Maybe you could do yours, like you're supposed to?
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. There was just so much traffic.
Okay. Maybe you could, work on it?
Yeah, I think I can do that.
As mentioned earlier, an indie game that was entirely original but profoundly successful was Undertale. A lot of its appeal was not in visuals, but in story. AAA games are usually gameplay-driven, meaning that they are designed to keep players engaged with the controls to do sweet flips or shoot a lot of guys. This isn't the case for Undertale, however. The controls are very simple, but the charm of the game comes from its original soundtrack, genuine story, and, very importantly, humor, something that a lot of people feel AAA games nowadays are lacking.
So, I think there's a few more things that we should talk about. I want to talk about gaming conventions, like PAX and E3.
E3.
So at PAX, it kind of presents a level playing field for a lot of indie game developers. Like, if you can get into PAX, it's a really good way to advertise your product because it allows for hands-on experiences. So, like, attendees of PAX can go and experience the games that you're putting out in their, like, alpha or beta stages, and give you feedback and get a lot more coverage for your game that you wouldn't have otherwise.
And E3 has really big sections for big name developers, more so than the smaller ones. Electronic Arts, EA, Microsoft, which has Xbox, Sony, which has PlayStation, Ubisoft, Bethesda, and Nintendo usually get large time slots at E3.
They have big reveals for new games and stuff like that draws like thousands of viewers, like hundreds of thousands of viewers each year that they do it. Merchandising.
Dude, it's Cade 6 from Destiny 2 from Bungie. Quality they put into this figure is actually really good. Like, there's texture all over this and everything.
Which is why it costs a lot of money.
They have a lot more money than indie games do for advertising.
Mm-hmm.
So they can put out little figures like this in like $100
packs. The Destiny 2 limited edition pack, which
yeah,
has
no
like
advertising.
All sorts of business in it. It's got a fancy book. I spent 115 whole human Earth dollars on this thing.
Indie games. So
indie games can't do that unless they have like an absurd amount of money, which is very rare.
You don't really see indie merchandising as much as you do like Call of Duty merchandising. A lot more revenue they have, so they can allocate a lot more of it. Big name game companies will also often pair with food items such as Doritos and Mountain Dew with gaming promotions to promote the sales of both the food items and the game itself. In conclusion, indie games need your support because of the barriers to entry and competition from major developers like yours. Yep. Because a lot of them can be very, very good, and just because of a lower budget or a smaller team doesn't necessarily equate to a bad game. Because money. They put it all over the place. Because they can, and they want your money. Economics. Thank you for watching our presentation, Dr. Rice.